Imagine being 70 years old and sentenced to death because you kept asking follow-up questions. That is the popular version of what happened to Socrates. Athens, birthplace of democracy and public debate, executed its most famous questioner in 399 BCE. But he was not killed simply because the city disliked philosophy. The real answer involves religion, wounded politics, dangerous former associates, and a defendant who treated his own capital trial like one final opportunity to examine the jury. Socrates also left us an awkward problem. He wrote nothing, not one dialogue, diary, or helpful note saying, "Here is what I actually believe." We reconstruct him through other people. Plato turned him into the central character of philosophical dialogues. Xenophon remembered him as a practical moral teacher. Aristophanes put a comic version of him on stage as an absurd intellectual floating in a basket. These portraits overlap, but they do not match perfectly. Historians call this the Socratic problem, which is scholarly language for discovering that the main witness has been dead for 24 centuries and never submitted any paperwork. The basic outline is fairly secure. Socrates was born around 470 BCE and spent most of his life in Athens. He was not a secluded thinker hiding among scrolls. He went into workshops, gymnasiums, streets, and public spaces, talking to politicians, craftsmen, poets, soldiers, and wealthy young men. His method sounded innocent. Someone would claim to understand courage, justice, piety, or leadership. Socrates would ask for a definition. Then he would test it with examples. If courage meant never retreating, was a careful military withdrawal cowardly? If justice meant helping friends, what if your friend wanted help doing something terrible? The conversation generally ended with the other person discovering that his sturdy definition had become a small pile of parts. This technique is often called the Socratic method, though Socrates himself did not leave an instruction manual. Plato's Socrates claimed that he possessed no grand store of wisdom. His special wisdom was recognizing his own ignorance. He compared himself to a gadfly irritating a large, sluggish horse. Athens was the horse. Socrates was the small, biting problem it could not swat away without looking unreasonable. He did not normally charge fees, unlike the professional teachers known as sophists. He also denied teaching in the ordinary sense. Young aristocrats simply gathered around him, watched respected men become tangled in their own claims, and sometimes copied the technique. This was entertaining if you were a rich young man with free time. It was less delightful if you were the respected citizen being publicly reduced to, "I suppose I have no idea what courage is." If bad drawings and remarkable lives are your preferred method of examining civilization, subscribe and remain calmly suspicious. Socrates was not merely a professional nuisance. He had served Athens as a heavily armed infantryman during the Peloponnesian War. Plato places him on campaigns at Potidaea, Delium, and Amphipolis. Stories of his endurance may have grown in the retelling, but his military service is widely accepted. This matters because Socrates was not attacking Athens from a safe distance. He had marched for it, fought for it, and watched its long conflict with Sparta go very badly. The war lasted, with interruptions, from 431 to 404 BCE. Athens endured plague, military disasters, political coups, and eventual defeat. Democracy was overthrown twice. The second time, Sparta supported an oligarchic regime remembered as the 30 Tyrants. The 30 ruled for only several months, but they executed opponents, seized property, and drove citizens into exile. One of their most violent leaders was Critias, a former associate of Socrates. Another controversial man linked with Socrates was Alcibiades, a brilliant aristocrat whose career included scandal, shifting loyalties, and defection from Athens during the war. This did not prove that Socrates supported either man. Adults are not automatically responsible for every ambitious person who once listened to them. Socrates also refused an order from the 30 to help arrest Leon of Salamis, who was marked for execution. Earlier, under the democracy, he had resisted an attempt to try several generals together through an unlawful procedure. His stubbornness was admirably nonpartisan. Every government eventually received some. But after democracy was restored in 403 BCE, Athenians were trying to rebuild a city that had experienced defeat and internal terror. An amnesty restricted prosecutions over many actions connected with the recent civil conflict. Openly trying Socrates for his political associations would have been difficult and dangerously divisive. Yet those associations could still shape how people saw him. There was also an older public image waiting for them. In 423 BCE, Aristophanes had staged The Clouds. Its Socrates runs a ridiculous school called the Thinkery, investigates the heavens, teaches slippery arguments, and helps people avoid their debts. This was comedy, not documentary evidence. The character bundled Socrates together with fashionable intellectuals he did not necessarily resemble. Still, caricatures can survive corrections. By the time of the trial, some Athenians had spent decades hearing that Socrates studied suspicious things, twisted arguments, and taught young men to disrespect ordinary values. Plato's Apology has Socrates complain that these old accusations were harder to answer than the official ones because they had been circulating for years. The formal case was brought by 3 citizens named Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon. Socrates was accused of corrupting the young, failing to recognize the gods recognized by Athens, and introducing new divine beings. Religion in Athens was not simply a private opinion tucked safely inside your head. Civic rituals, festivals, sacrifices, and the welfare of the city were connected. Socrates spoke about a divine sign that warned him against certain actions. He also challenged traditional stories in which the gods behaved badly. To admirers, this could sound like serious moral religion. To opponents, it could sound like someone redesigning the gods in public. Then came the trial before a large citizen jury. Our fullest account is Plato's Apology, which means defense speech, not an expression of regret. It is probably closer to the historical Socrates than many of Plato's later dialogues, but it is not a courtroom transcript. Plato shaped the material, and the prosecutor's speeches have not survived. Even with that warning, Socrates' defense is astonishing. He cross-examines Miletus and exposes weaknesses in the accusation. He argues that nobody intentionally corrupts the people around him, because living among damaged citizens would harm the corrupter too. If he caused harm unintentionally, he says, he should be corrected rather than prosecuted. Reasonable points. Then Socrates explains that he will not stop questioning people, even if the jury offers to spare him on that condition. His mission, he says, comes from the god. He tells the jurors that he benefits Athens by forcing citizens to care about wisdom and character rather than money and reputation. He refuses to parade his family before them to beg for mercy. He reminds them of his resistance to unlawful political pressure. He effectively tells the court that it needs him more than he needs it. The jury convicted him by what appears to have been a fairly narrow majority. A second vote would determine the punishment. The prosecution proposed death. Socrates could propose an alternative. Exile or a serious fine might have saved him. Instead, Plato's Socrates initially suggests that he deserves free meals in the Prytaneum, an honor given to distinguished benefactors and victorious athletes. This was a bold response from a man who had just been found guilty of harming the city. With friends offering financial support, he eventually proposes a fine of 30 minae. The jury chooses death. So Athens did not execute Socrates merely for asking questions. It executed a deeply unpopular citizen after a legal prosecution for religious and moral offenses. Political trauma almost certainly formed part of the atmosphere, though historians still debate how directly it motivated the case. Socrates' own refusal to flatter the jury, stop philosophizing, or suggest an acceptable punishment helped turn conviction into execution. Then he received one final exit. While Socrates waited in prison, his friend Crito came with an escape plan. The guards could apparently be persuaded, and friends were ready to move him elsewhere. Socrates refused. In Plato's Crito, he argues that suffering injustice does not justify committing injustice in return. Escaping after accepting the city's laws throughout his life would damage those laws and confirm the accusation that he corrupted others. The argument is not simple obedience to every order. Socrates had already disobeyed commands he considered unjust. It is a final test of whether his principles still applied when the result was personally catastrophic. After a delay caused by a sacred voyage to Delos, the execution went ahead. Plato's Phaedo presents Socrates drinking hemlock among his friends, continuing to discuss philosophy as the numbness rises through his body. How closely the literary details match the historical death is uncertain. The calmness is part memory, part philosophy, and possibly part carefully constructed legend. Athens succeeded in silencing one elderly man. It also gave Plato the defining story of his career. The result was a permanent reversal. The city judged Socrates, but history kept reopening the case. His questions survived because they were never a finished doctrine that could be buried with him. They were a habit of asking what people meant, how they knew, and whether their lives matched their claims. Athens executed its most annoying citizen. In doing so, it made him impossible to get rid of.